So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to try and show you how language, what we use on a day-to-day basis to communicate, can influence and change the way we see the world. So what exactly do I mean by this? Well, let's use colour as an example. In English, we have 11 basic terms to categorise colour. Other languages are different. For example, the Himba tribe have just 5 basic terms, which means they don't have 2 distinct words for blue and green. So this means that they don't see blue, in other words, this blue square doesn't jump out at them. Instead, one of those green squares jumps out at them because it's a different shade of green, and they have 2 distinct words for those 2 different shades. Can you see which one? If I make it slightly easier, you can probably see it now. So just like how the Himba found it hard to see the blue, we find it hard to see this different shade of green because we don't have 2 distinct words for these 2 different shades of green. So why does language make us see the world so differently? I mean, after all, biologically, we are all the same, right? Well, it begins from a very young age. It begins from when we start to learn a new language. And although somewhat controversial due to the nature versus nurture debate, psychologists have shown that when we begin to learn a new language, that is when we begin to change the way we see the world. So that means when you start to learn to talk and make sense of the world around you, you're already shaping your world. When you see something like this, you learn to pay attention to details depending on what you need in order to speak your language properly. Different languages require you to pay attention to different details. So this means you remember things differently. For example, in the previous slide, 2 of the bins had blue signs on them. Were they light or dark blue? If you spoke Russian, this probably wouldn't be a question, because in Russian, there is no single word for what we call blue in the English language. Instead, they have 2 words, goluboy and sini for light and dark blue. So Russian forces its speakers to distinguish between the different shades of blue when they identify blue. So, of course, languages don't just differ by colour. There are many other differences. In English, you can say, I broke the ball, and not specify if it was an accident or if it was intentional. But in Spanish, you would have to express it in such a way that it shows if it was an accident or if it was an intentional act. Or maybe a bridge. How would you describe a bridge? Would you say it is strong and sturdy, or maybe elegant and beautiful? If you spoke a language with grammatical gender, like French or German, you would likely be biased to describe it based on the gender of the word bridge. Or maybe something basic like time. Many languages actually say that the future is behind them and the past is in front of them. I mean, if the future is ahead of us, it's in plain sight, and that makes no sense, right? Or imagine needing to be oriented and knowing where north was all the time. Not all languages uses relative direction like left and right. Some languages actually uses absolute directions. So they'll say something like, please pass a cup to the northeast side of the table, please. So I know these are just a few examples, but hopefully I've shown you that languages are unique in their own ways, and it can influence the way you think. And so this means that the dominant language you use can influence the way you think, what you focus on, how you remember, and in some ways, language is so fundamental to building complex ideas and thoughts that even thinking about how language affects our thoughts is affected by the language we think in. So one thing to keep in mind, though, is just because a word doesn't exist in a particular language, it doesn't mean that speakers of that language can't understand or comprehend the meaning. For example, in English, we don't have a word for when someone helps you out, but you really, really wish they didn't help you out. But due to social conventions, you still had to say thanks and pretend all's well and good. Well, the Japanese have a word for that. Arigata meiwaku. We don't have a word for it, but I'm sure we know that feeling. So what does this all mean, and why is it important? Well, given that language and thought are so intertwined, and that language can allow you, or maybe even force you to think from a different perspective, it might be useful to try and think in a different language or ask someone who thinks in a different language when you want a different perspective on something, when you're stuck on a problem, maybe you want to avoid bias. It might just give you that spark of inspiration that you need. So hopefully in the past 4.5 minutes or so, I've shown you that language can actually influence the way you think and the way you see the world. So maybe it's a good time now to stop procrastinating, set yourself a deadline, and learn that new language you've been meaning to learn for the past couple of years. Thank you.
Please give it up for Peggy Kuo.